The war had ended, but the shadows of its horrors lingered like smoke over a devastated continent. Germany lay in ruins, cities reduced to rubble, factories silent, and the streets haunted by the ghosts of millions lost. Yet, amidst the destruction, the world stumbled upon secrets that would not only shape the immediate post-war era, but would also influence the course of history for decades to come. Hidden laboratories, cutting-edge experiments, and the minds behind Hitler's war machine were waiting to be discovered. And the Allies, particularly the United States, recognized that within these ruins lay a treasure trove of knowledge and danger. By 1945, Germany's scientific community had achieved what the rest of the world could barely imagine. Wernher von Braun's V-2 rockets had already demonstrated the terrifying possibilities of guided missiles, striking London and Antwerp with deadly precision. These rockets, capable of reaching the edge of the stratosphere before delivering their payloads, represented not just a technological marvel but a new form of warfare, one that could make geography irrelevant in conflict. Behind von Braun were hundreds of scientists, engineers and technicians who had been meticulously trained to push the boundaries of physics, chemistry, and engineering under the strictest demands of the Nazi regime. But brilliance often walked hand in hand with horror. The V-2 rockets were not the product of benign laboratories or safe experimentation. They were built with the sweat and blood of thousands of forced laborers. Prisoners from concentration camps, many already emaciated from starvation, were crammed into tunnels at Mittelbau-Dora, working 12-hour shifts assembling rockets under deadly conditions. Typhus, accidents, and abuse claimed countless lives. Estimates vary, but historians agree that thousands perished in the production of the V-2 missiles alone. The marvel of human ingenuity in this context was inseparable from the atrocities committed to achieve it. Von Braun was far from the only figure of note. Arthur Rudolph, another brilliant engineer, had overseen the assembly and testing of the V-2 program. Like von Braun, he was a member of the Nazi Party and had, in his role, directly benefited from the forced labor of prisoners. Hubertus Strughold, known in later years as the father of space medicine, had been involved in aviation medicine experiments that included ethically reprehensible human testing. These men, and many like them, represented the pinnacle of scientific achievement, but also the darkest facets of human morality. As the Allied armies pushed deeper into Germany, capturing territory and dismantling the Nazi war apparatus, intelligence officers realized the stakes extended beyond mere victory on the battlefield. The Soviet Union, too, was scouring Germany for advanced technology and the scientists who had created it. The post-war world would not only be about who won the war, it would be about who inherited the minds that could dominate the future. In this context, knowledge became the ultimate weapon, and scientists became strategic assets of extraordinary value. It was in this environment of urgency, ambition, and moral compromise that the United States conceived a secret program, initially called Operation Overcast, which would later be renamed Operation Paperclip. Its mission was straightforward in concept but morally complex in execution. Locate, recruit, and bring German scientists to the United States, regardless of their political affiliations or involvement in Nazi atrocities, to bolster American military and technological capabilities. The program was formalized by the Joint Intelligence Objectives Agency, JIOA, under the auspices of the U.S. Army. Agents were tasked with not just identifying potential candidates, but also evaluating their loyalty, expertise, and, crucially, their war records. The ethical line was thin, almost invisible. Reports were sanitized, and in some cases, outright falsified to ensure that scientists with clear ties to the Nazi Party or the SS could be cleared for immigration. It was a pragmatic decision wrapped in moral ambiguity. The knowledge these men possessed was too valuable to leave in Europe or allow it to fall into Soviet hands. One of the earliest and most significant successes of Operation Paperclip was the extraction of von Braun and his team from Peenemünde. Under the eyes of the Allies, the scientists were quietly relocated, often in military vehicles, away from potential Soviet capture. Their knowledge of rocketry, aerodynamics, and propulsion systems was immediately recognized as a national asset. The U.S. government was willing to turn a blind eye to past affiliations in exchange for the promise of American technological supremacy. Von Braun himself was a complex figure, a visionary engineer with a deep understanding of rocket science, yet morally compromised by his voluntary collaboration with the Nazi regime. He had been an enthusiastic supporter of Hitler's ambitions in the early 1930s, joining the National Socialist German Workers' Party in 1937 and the SS in 1940. Yet, in the context of Operation Paperclip, his brilliance overshadowed these associations. The U.S. military saw him not as a war criminal, but as a tool for winning the technological race that was already beginning between East and West. The extraction and employment of these scientists required meticulous planning. Safe houses, military transports, and secure communication channels were established to relocate personnel without drawing public attention. Some scientists were provided with new identities, and all were subject to vetting by intelligence officers who weighed their technical expertise against potential political liabilities. In essence, the United States was creating a parallel society of hidden experts whose pasts were deliberately obscured to serve national interests. The ethical compromises inherent in Paperclip were glaring. Men who had once overseen human suffering were now celebrated as contributors to the American defense program. Yet, from the perspective of U.S. policymakers, this was a necessary trade-off. The emerging Cold War had already begun to shape the strategic priorities of the nation. The Soviet Union was no longer just a former ally, it was a looming threat, and any delay in securing advanced technology could have devastating consequences. Rocketry, of course, was just the beginning. The German scientists brought over under Paperclip had expertise in jet propulsion, advanced aerodynamics, chemical weapons, and even rudimentary biological research. Some had been involved in experiments that tested human endurance, the effects of hypoxia, and the impacts of high-velocity flight on the human body. Their knowledge was invaluable for both military and exploratory applications. In Huntsville, Alabama, and Fort Bliss, Texas, laboratories were quickly repurposed to accommodate this influx of talent. Missiles were designed, engines were tested, and the seeds of the American space program were sown, all under the watchful eyes of men who had once worked for Hitler. The secrecy of the operation was absolute, public awareness was minimal, and internal documentation was tightly controlled. Any leaks could have sparked outrage, given the involvement of men with clear Nazi affiliations. Yet, for the scientists themselves, the opportunity represented a chance to continue their work without fear of prosecution, imprisonment, or Soviet recruitment. For von Braun and others, America offered not just safety, but the resources and institutional support to realize projects that had been impossible in wartime Germany. In many ways, Operation Paperclip exemplified the paradoxes of post-war geopolitics. On the one hand, it accelerated scientific progress, positioning the United States as a technological superpower. On the other, it raised profound moral questions. How could a nation that had fought against tyranny reconcile its reliance on individuals complicit in atrocities? Was the promise of missile superiority and space exploration worth the compromise of ethical standards? As the first waves of scientists arrived, they were integrated into a carefully controlled environment. Housing compounds were established, research priorities defined, and access to sensitive information regulated. The U.S. Army and later the fledgling NASA oversaw the work of these German émigrés, ensuring that their expertise was directed toward projects of strategic importance. From long-range missiles to jet aircraft and early space probes, the influence of these men would be felt for decades. Yet the tension between genius and culpability remained. Von Braun, Rudolf Strughold, and others were celebrated for their contributions, but their pasts could never be fully erased. Behind the closed doors of American labs, discussions about ethics, accountability, and historical memory were often muted in favor of expediency. The United States had secured a technological advantage, but at a cost that history would continue to scrutinize. By the late 1940s, the scope of Operation Paperclip had expanded. Scientists were no longer confined to rocketry. They were brought into programs involving chemical analysis, human physiology studies, and even early concepts of biological defense. The knowledge these men carried was immense, and the stakes could not have been higher. The Cold War loomed, and the race for technological supremacy was now as much about ideology and strategic dominance as it was about raw scientific achievement. The early stages of Paperclip were, in essence, a prelude to the space race. The rockets designed by von Braun and his colleagues would evolve into launch vehicles capable of sending satellites, and eventually humans, into orbit. The expertise of men who had once sought to deliver destruction across Europe was now redirected toward exploration and innovation. Yet the moral shadows of the past lingered, reminding all involved that scientific progress is never truly divorced from the human context in which it occurs. The legacy of this period is paradoxical. Operation Paperclip brought unprecedented talent to the United States, catalyzing the missile and space programs that defined the latter half of the 20th century. Simultaneously, it embedded ethical compromises deep within the fabric of American scientific achievement. The very individuals who had overseen human suffering now became architects of progress, their pasts intentionally obscured in service of national security and global positioning. In understanding Operation Paperclip, one must confront these tensions: the collision of morality and pragmatism, the delicate balance between justice and strategic advantage, and the hidden mechanisms through which history is shaped. The scientists brought to America were neither heroes nor simple villains. They were instruments in a broader geopolitical struggle, their brilliance intertwined with the darkest elements of the human experience. The scientists arrived quietly, under the cover of military transport, often at night, to prevent curiosity or protest. Fort Bliss in Texas became the first major hub, a sprawling desert installation where German engineers were assimilated into American missile programs. The landscape itself seemed symbolic, harsh, remote, and controlled. Here, von Braun and his team began the work that would later launch humans into space. But in these early days, the mission was far less glamorous. The Cold War was brewing, and the United States needed missiles capable of striking anywhere in the world, quickly and reliably. The secrecy surrounding these programs was staggering. Guards patrolled the compounds, fences were electrified, and even American personnel had limited access to certain laboratories. The scientists, for their part, were under constant supervision. Their German research notebooks, experimental data, and correspondence were meticulously cataloged and examined. Any hint that they retained loyalty to Germany or Nazi ideology could jeopardize the entire operation. Yet, despite these precautions, a subtle undercurrent persisted, a tension between the past and the present, between genius and culpability. Wernher von Braun became the figurehead of this transformation. His charisma and technical acumen allowed him to navigate the complexities of American bureaucracy. He spoke English fluently, understood the nuances of military protocol, and could translate the esoteric mathematics of rocketry into actionable plans for U.S. engineers. By 1946, von Braun's team had begun work on the Redstone missile, a direct descendant of the V-2 rocket refined for American purposes. These missiles were the seeds of a new era, a bridge from wartime destruction to peacetime exploration, though the ethical shadows never left. Arthur Rudolph, the V-2 program chief, also played a critical role. In Germany, he had overseen the Mittelwerk facility, where forced laborers suffered and died to produce the rockets. In America, his organizational genius was repurposed for efficiency in missile assembly, quality control, and production management. Under his direction, the U.S. missile program achieved in a few years what had taken Germany under the pressures of total war. Yet the human cost behind his expertise remained, largely unspoken, an invisible stain on every launch pad and assembly line. The U.S. government went to extraordinary lengths to secure not just personnel, but also technology. Secret agreements were made with German authorities to transfer documentation, blueprints, and experimental data. Agents sifted through Nazi archives, confiscating research on jet propulsion, chemical weapons, and aerodynamics. Some of these documents were incomplete, damaged, or deliberately destroyed by retreating German officials, but enough survived to provide a foundation for rapid American advancement. One particularly sensitive area was chemical and biological research. Scientists who had worked on nerve agents like sarin, tabun, and soman, as well as on pathogens like anthrax, were quietly brought to America. Their work was intended for defensive purposes, but the dual-use nature of this knowledge was obvious to those involved. Laboratories were established where controlled experiments could continue, isolated from public scrutiny, with layers of security to prevent leaks or accidents. The moral implications of employing individuals who had once overseen experiments on prisoners remained a topic of whispered debate within military circles, though no official accountability ever materialized. In the backdrop of all this, espionage and the fear of Soviet interception drove many decisions. The Soviets had deployed their own teams to capture German scientists and technology, creating a silent but high-stakes race. For American intelligence, the stakes were existential. Securing advanced technology and personnel before the USSR could mean the difference between strategic superiority and vulnerability. In this environment, ethical concerns were routinely subordinated to practical considerations. Scientists who might otherwise have been prosecuted were fast-tracked into American programs, and any inconvenient affiliations were carefully concealed or rewritten. By the late 1940s, Operation Paperclip had expanded far beyond its initial scope. In Huntsville, Alabama, Redstone Arsenal became a bustling center of innovation, housing not just von Braun's team, but dozens of other German engineers. The desert testing grounds at White Sands Proving Ground in New Mexico became a crucible for missile trials, with rockets igniting the night sky in controlled explosions that echoed the destructive power of their predecessors, though now directed under the banner of American defense. The scientists themselves often faced internal conflicts. Some had genuinely hoped to continue their research peacefully in the United States, detached from ideology. Others remained quietly loyal to old Nazi beliefs, though pragmatic enough to work under new supervision. American officials had to navigate this delicate balance, rewarding cooperation while monitoring for signs of dissent or sabotage. Intelligence officers maintained detailed dossiers on every scientist, tracking interactions, communications, and even personal conduct to ensure operational security. As missile programs advanced, the scientists' influence began to permeate other branches of American research. Rocket technology intersected with nuclear delivery systems, jet aircraft design, and eventually space exploration. The insights of former Nazis were integrated into education programs, training new American engineers and physicists in techniques developed under Hitler. The irony was stark. The very men whose genius had fueled the destruction of Europe were now shaping the tools of American global supremacy. Meanwhile, the Cold War intensified. By 1947, the Truman Doctrine had formalized American opposition to Soviet expansion, and the need for advanced technology became even more urgent. Operation Paperclip scientists were not merely employees, they were strategic assets. Every rocket test, every aerodynamic calculation, every experimental flight carried the weight of international tension. Their knowledge gave the United States a decisive edge, but it also highlighted the uncomfortable reality that progress had been purchased with moral compromise. Little-known incidents during this period reveal the full complexity of the operation. For instance, some scientists attempted to smuggle equipment or retain personal research from Germany, hoping to continue work independently or for financial gain. In other cases, internal conflicts arose over the ethical direction of certain experiments, particularly those related to human endurance and high-altitude flight. Intelligence officers frequently had to intervene, balancing the needs of national security with the risks of exposing morally dubious activities. The ethical dilemmas were compounded by public ignorance. To Americans, the narrative was simple. Brilliant minds had been brought to help secure the nation, contributing to the space program and advanced missile defense. Behind closed doors, however, military officials and scientists grappled with the knowledge that many of these men had been complicit in atrocities, some directly responsible for the deaths of thousands. In letters, memoranda, and classified reports, debates over accountability and risk were quietly documented, though few were ever made public. As the 1950s approached, the fruits of Operation Paperclip became increasingly visible. Von Braun's team launched Redstone missiles capable of suborbital flight, paving the way for future space exploration. Arthur Rudolph's organizational methods enabled rapid production of increasingly sophisticated rockets. Other scientists, formerly associated with Nazi medical and chemical research, contributed to early experiments in human physiology under extreme conditions, providing foundational knowledge for astronaut training. These achievements were celebrated in the press, in scientific journals, and within government circles, often without acknowledgement of the morally complex path that had brought them to America. The Cold War itself shaped the trajectory of Paperclip's legacy. By integrating German expertise, the United States had effectively preempted Soviet attempts to capture the same talent, ensuring a technological advantage that would influence conflicts, deterrent strategies, and the eventual space race. Intelligence operations expanded to monitor Soviet reactions, intercept communications, and secure sensitive data, creating a vast web of espionage that connected laboratories in Texas, New Mexico, and Alabama with command centers in Washington, D.C. At the same time, the scientists' backgrounds occasionally caused friction. Some American engineers, aware of their colleagues' Nazi affiliations, expressed moral discomfort. Congressional hearings were hinted at but carefully managed, and press coverage was limited. The government's strategy was clear: protect the operation, suppress inconvenient truths, and prioritize the strategic imperative of technological dominance. In this sense, Paperclip was not just a scientific program. It was a carefully managed exercise in propaganda, secrecy, and ethical ambiguity. By the mid-1950s, the first tangible outcomes of Paperclip were undeniable. Rocket technology had progressed far beyond what Germany or the Allies had achieved during the war. American military planners could envision intercontinental ballistic missiles capable of reaching the Soviet heartland. NASA, still in its infancy, relied heavily on the knowledge of von Braun and his colleagues. Spaceflight, once a dream confined to science fiction, was now a concrete objective. And yet, beneath the surface of progress lay the unspoken truth. These accomplishments were inseparable from the moral compromises made to secure them. The integration of former Nazis into American programs also had a ripple effect on education and scientific culture. Universities, research institutes, and government labs adopted techniques developed in Germany, influencing curricula, engineering standards, and even research ethics. The lines between experimentation and operational necessity were often blurred, reflecting the pragmatic approach that had guided Paperclip from the start. Despite the monumental successes, controversies simmered beneath the surface. Decades later, investigations would reveal that some individuals had participated in war crimes, raising questions about accountability and historical memory. The ethical tension that defined Operation Paperclip persisted long after the rockets had left the launch pads and the scientists had retired. The debate over whether national security justified the employment of individuals complicit in atrocities remains unresolved, a testament to the enduring moral complexity of this chapter in history. As the 1960s dawned, the legacy of Operation Paperclip reached its most visible stage, the space race. The United States, propelled by the expertise of men who had once served Hitler, stood on the brink of the stars. Von Braun, now leading NASA's Marshall Space Flight Center in Huntsville, Alabama, orchestrated the development of the Saturn V rocket, the colossal machine that would carry humanity to the moon. Every calculation, every structural innovation, every stage of the rocket bore the fingerprints of minds that had once worked under the shadow of tyranny. Arthur Rudolph's organizational genius was equally critical. His meticulous management of the production process ensured that complex systems, from propulsion to guidance, were assembled with precision and reliability. The Saturn V, standing over 110 meters tall, was not just a marvel of engineering. It was a symbol of how knowledge, even born from morally compromised origins, could alter the trajectory of human achievement. Yet, within the controlled environment of NASA, the ethical ghosts of the past were ever present. The stories of forced labor, human suffering, and wartime complicity remained largely hidden from the public, buried beneath headlines celebrating American ingenuity. The contributions of these scientists extended beyond the moon. Redstone and Jupiter missiles, early satellite launch vehicles, and experimental high-altitude aircraft all benefited from German expertise. Research in human physiology, pioneered by figures like Hubertus Strughold, informed astronaut training, including survival in microgravity and exposure to extreme environments. The knowledge gained from decades of morally fraught experiments had been repurposed, ostensibly for peaceful exploration and scientific advancement, though the origins of that knowledge remained ethically complex. Operation Paperclip also had a profound influence on the geopolitical landscape. By absorbing German expertise, the United States gained a decisive advantage in missile technology, space exploration, and military capability, effectively preempting Soviet efforts to recruit the same talent. The Cold War, already defined by espionage, ideology, and nuclear brinkmanship, was further shaped by this clandestine transfer of knowledge. Behind the glamorous facade of rocket launches and space exploration lay a shadowy history, a story of compromise, secrecy, and the moral ambiguity of victory. Yet, even within this context of triumph, controversy persisted. Decades later, revelations about the pasts of certain scientists sparked ethical debates and public scrutiny. Investigations into the wartime activities of von Braun, Rudolph, and Strughold raised difficult questions. Could one separate genius from culpability? Should their contributions to American technological dominance absolve them of participation in atrocities? These questions remain unresolved, a lingering testament to the tension between progress and morality that defined Operation Paperclip. The human stories embedded within this narrative are equally compelling. Some scientists embraced their new lives in America, integrating into communities, mentoring young engineers, and witnessing the launch of humans into orbit. Others remained shadowed by the moral weight of their pasts, aware that their expertise had come at an incalculable human cost. Personal letters, diaries, and later interviews reveal moments of reflection, regret, and rationalization, emotions that underscore the profound ethical complexity of the operation. Ultimately, Operation Paperclip is a story of paradox. It demonstrates the power of human ingenuity while exposing the compromises often made in its pursuit. It is a narrative in which the boundaries between heroism and culpability, science and ethics, progress and human cost are forever blurred. The rockets that soared into the sky carried with them the lessons of a dark past, yet also the promise of exploration and discovery. The legacy of these men is thus inseparable from both the achievements they enabled and the shadows they cast. Even today, as we celebrate milestones in space exploration and technological advancement, the echoes of Operation Paperclip remain. The moral compromises, the hidden histories, and the calculated decisions of the immediate post-war period continue to resonate, reminding us that the pursuit of power and progress often comes with ethical costs that are never fully erased. In understanding this chapter of history, we confront the uncomfortable truth that knowledge is rarely neutral. and that the quest for advancement can demand choices that reverberate across generations.